It can be eye-opening and it can be your salvation. At some level, getting out of a toxic relationship and the bad feelings that accompany it are a form of survivor guilt. Self preservation and self protection are all very nice sounding words, but putting them into practice is a whole other level.
So let's talk about trauma bonding, a term that comes up often when we're talking about narcissistic relationships. So let's take a step back and ask the question, have you ever looked at your relationship and thought, if a good friend told me that they were being treated in their relationship the way that I am being treated, I would pray that my friend would run away from their relationship as fast as they can. So that's an interesting conundrum, because you'd say that to your friend, but if that is how you are able to view your relationship, but you still can't get out, even though you would tell anyone else to get out of this kind of a situation, you may very well be what we call trauma bonded. The term trauma bonding pretty much encapsulates the entire narcissistic relational dynamic. And lots of people use this term, so let's make sure we get some clarity on it. Some people have likened this idea of trauma bonding to the proverbial Stockholm Syndrome. Now, the Stockholm Syndrome refers to this story in which a group of hostages ended up sort of falling in love with their captors. So in essence, they had created an emotional bond in the face of the trauma of being held against their will. Now, frankly, more recent research has debunked the Stockholm Syndrome as a thing, but the theme of trauma bonding is mirrored in some of what we see as sort of being the patterns or the top notes of Stockholm Syndrome. This idea of creating an emotional bond to somebody who's a perpetrator of harm in your life. Now, trauma bonding is reflected in the classical narcissistic relationship cycle: idealization, devaluation, and discarding. Trauma bonding reflects the very tight bonds that are observed in relationships characterized by unhealthy patterns. And these unhealthy patterns include things like inconsistency, invalidation, devaluation, dehumanization, and chaos. In essence, the bonds are made even more watertight around the traumatic and cruel cycles of the relationship. It's basically like equating abuse and trauma with what someone is labeling as love. Now, as I have talked about not only in this series, but in many other videos, the cycle of the narcissistic relationship, idealize, devalue, discard, hoover, and then start it all over again, is very similar to the cycle of addiction. And in fact, the term trauma bonding was initially coined by someone named Dr. Patrick Carnes, and his work was very much focused on sex and love addiction. But again, it gets at this idea of the addictive cycle of an unhealthy relationship. Now, in a healthy relationship, which someday may end, because healthy relationships do sometimes end, the ties aren't as convoluted and twisted because they are not traumatic bonds. Instead, when you end a relationship that was generally healthy, there may be a sense of nostalgia and even a sense of gratitude for the growth you experienced in the relationship. You don't feel that primitive sense of devastation when a healthy relationship ends, but perhaps you may experience a pang and some grief, real grief, for lost memories and missing somebody. But overall, the overarching theme ultimately is often a sense of gratitude and grace for a part of your story, and you move forward from that intact. Now, a lot of that is also predicated on having a history of secure attachment. Now, trauma bonding is something else entirely. It often happens at a blindingly fast speed. And in that way, because it's so quick, it becomes easy to create the dysfunctional cycles of your past. Many people, when they are entering into a trauma-bonded relationship, they'll describe it as intense and amazing and passionate and once in a lifetime and overwhelming. But above all else, it's fast, and then one would say it's incredibly intense. And the speed of these trauma-bonded relationships plays upon another key element of the trauma bond. It's the repetition cycle, the repeating we see in the trauma bond. Trauma bonding reflects an attachment style. And attachment styles are set very early in our lives with what are called primary caregivers, which for most people are their parents. Early relationships, parental relationships that were characterized by push, pull, chaos, abuse, intense emotion, rejection, and cycles of idealization and devaluation and discarding, can set the tracks for chaos and invalidation. This kind of sort of chaotic early environment can result in what we call anxious and or avoidant attachment styles. And people with those attachment styles can be more vulnerable to trauma bonding cycles as an adult if these attachment styles aren't addressed in intense therapeutic settings. Now, the quickness and the intensity of what are typically trauma-bonded relationships are often mistaken as chemistry. And as I have written in books in the past, that thing called chemistry is actually familiarity. It's a new person's alternating idealization and devaluation reminds us of this early relationship we have with these primary caregivers. It's a familiar chaos. It's so familiar that it evokes something almost primal in us. And we mistake that dysfunctional early memory for chemistry. It's like a developmental deja vu. I've been here before. And the mistake we make is to call it chemistry and romanticize it. Now, children in trauma-bonded relationships learn to do one thing very, very well. They learn to justify their parents' abusive behavior, to keep secrets, to blame themselves, and to idealize their parents, to protect their parents. Children can't get their heads around the idea that a caregiver is harmful, because it really kind of leaves this big gaping hole. If a caregiver is harmful, then what? Who's going to take care of them? Kids don't get to have a plan B. And so their sweet, beautiful little brains sadly have to learn to justify, rationalize, and appease abusive parents. That cycle can then potentially play out in the trauma-bonded adult relationship with the person even thinking about it. It is that familiar that, in fact, to do it differently really would require some thinking. So these relationships are quick, they're intense, they feel like chemistry, they might even feel like magic. And the trauma bond, as a result, slowly gets thicker and thicker. Now, I'm going to use this to take a strange little sideline here and I'm going to talk about slot machines, okay? If you've ever played a slot machine, you're going to understand this. But slot machines can actually help you understand trauma bonding. Narcissistic relationships work because they are like slot machines. You know, slot machines where you put the coin in and you pull the handle, and if you're lucky, you win an award, or you win lots of money. Slot machines work on something called intermittent reinforcement. It's a very fancy way of saying that you don't know when a reward is coming, and you don't know how big the reward will be. You know sometimes that reward can be humongous. More often than not, you don't get anything. This kind of cycle, reward cycle, is the most difficult to unstick a person from. And anybody who's ever played a slot machine knows that. You play the machine, you hold out thinking, maybe I'm going to win on the next pull, and maybe I'm going to win on the next pull. A healthy relationship is actually like a boring slot machine. Like imagine a slot machine where like every third pull you get a dollar. You put a $2 in, you get a dollar back. You put a dollar in, you get a dollar back. It would actually not be very interesting or exciting. It would be reassuring and it would be healthy, but it sure as heck wouldn't be addictive. Now, regular slot machines, the ones you see in the casinos, they just take our money. Now, sometimes they pay out just a little bit, and that's enough to keep us in the game. Sometimes they pay out a bit more. So instead of paying out, you put it in a quarter and you get $5, and that really keeps us in the game. And one day, and we might see it happen to other people, they may pay out a ton. But most of us will never experience that. But we keep sticking around and keep money in to see if it happens. Because after all, it happened to someone else. Look, there's their picture. It happened to that guy. But more often than not, we put money in the slot machine and nothing happens. But we keep sticking it out because we think we're going to get the prize, the jackpot, the reward. That inconsistent reward is a key element of the trauma bond. The rewards and the occasional payouts a person gets in these relationships become the rationalization for the entire relationship. But we had so much fun that one time we went to Paris and you didn't yell at me for that whole day. And that one trip to Paris, that one little jackpot becomes a rationalization for thousands of days of verbal abuse and invalidation. A rationalization for all of the cash you put into that slot machine. The trauma bond means that for a person, chaos equals love. The old traumatic themes of a childhood, for example, your initial definition of love, which may very well have been chaotic, are played out again. And once again, just like the child, you label it as love. Because this adult chaotic relationship is so reminiscent of the child trauma bond, you make the same rationalizations and the same justifications as you did for your parents. She really does love me. He didn't really mean that. She had a tough childhood. He kind of does take good care of me. In fact, a big part of the trauma bond is something that I term the backstory problem. Trauma-bonded people make excuses for their abuser. They make excuses for their abusive behavior around, for example, their tough childhood, or maybe a childhood where they were impoverished, or understanding that maybe your partner wants to prove himself to his dad, or you'll say things like, oh, he talks without thinking. He doesn't really mean it. The trauma-bonded person is very good at one thing, and that's gaslighting themselves. So, where do you see this link between narcissists and trauma bonds? Part of it relates to that anxious and avoidant attachment cycle that characterizes the entire addictive relationship cycle. Narcissists often are able to draw partners in with intensity, charm, charisma, and it often goes quick. The love bombing can be exciting sexual experiences, exciting travel, exciting concerts, lots of things that have nothing to do with intimacy. By definition, narcissistic relationships always require lots of justifications because without you making lots of rationalizations for this relationship, there's often no healthy reason to stay. You have to come up with those reasons because just as when you were a child, you couldn't step away. Now, trauma bonding can leave a person feeling like they're irrational, saying things to themselves or to the world like, I know this relationship is awful and unhealthy, but I miss her, or I still love him, or I would take him back, or I can't imagine living without her. Even while a person will acknowledge that their relationship was unhealthy or even abusive, this cycle of trauma bonding is why narcissistic relationships are so difficult to climb out of. So, what are you supposed to do? Because obviously, lots of people leave narcissistic relationships. I see it happen quite regularly in the work I do. And I know it's not easy. It's much more difficult, believe it or not, to leave a narcissistic relationship than it is to leave a healthy relationship, which almost seems paradoxical, but it is. So the question becomes, where do you begin? First, to leave one of these trauma-bonded relationships, you have to acknowledge that what is happening is abuse. I have to say that when my clients tell me their narcissistic relationship stories from the very beginning, and the trauma bonding becomes very apparent to me as they tell me about their relationship. Oftentimes, the first time I make a comment that the behaviors that they're reporting in their relationship are actually quite abusive, they get quite surprised at my use of that word, abusive. It's a framework that they never even acknowledged. They never even thought that that would be the word that would be used to describe their relationship. But that's often the first step. It's that willingness to acknowledge that these cycles and that their narcissistic partner or family member or whoever this person is in their life, that this behavior is abusive. The second thing is you have to do the deeper dive into your own early attachments. And this does almost always require the guidance of therapy. You have to really look and see, can you see the parallel between the cycles that are playing out for you now and that trauma-bonded cycle from your own childhood? And as an adult, part of the fantasy is that you might be able to master, to like grown up and power through that trauma-bonded relationship that you couldn't do as a child. You know, the third thing you need to keep in mind is you have to recognize that this is not a slot machine. In fact, there is no jackpot here. This particular slot machine called your narcissistic relationship is just going to keep taking your money. And in this case, in the case of a relationship, it's not just your money, it's your energy, it's your authenticity, it's your soul, it's your heart. The narcissist is really not likely to change significantly enough to make a difference. And simply understanding that will break you out and can break you out of the blindness of the trauma-bonded cycle. The fourth thing is to judge the relationship in the here and now. And that means you gotta jump on the mindfulness train. You've gotta look at their lies now, their cheating now, their invalidation now. And stop yourself from making these justifications and rationalizations. When you do that, these cycles look a lot less like love and a lot more like abuse and a lot less like a project where you're going to rescue someone. The fifth thing is to make a list of the things that make you uncomfortable about the relationship and keep adding to it. In your weaker moments, when you feel like you're going to get sucked back in or hoovered back in, look at that list. It becomes a list of the abuse you have suffered, and it may help you sever some of that bond when you can look at it with more clear eyes. The sixth thing is you got to get therapy if you're going through a trauma-bonded cycle. This work is best done with a guide and someone who understands both narcissism and trauma. Trauma bonding is very, very much to me synonymous with the cycle of the narcissistic relationship. Now, are there trauma-bonded cycles that don't include narcissism? Absolutely. It's a wider term. But the fact is, trauma bonding blinds you, it confuses you, and it plays upon your vulnerabilities. You need to pay attention to those early, heady, and very quick days in a relationship. Intense and fast relationships are often danger signals that distract you from the abuse that inevitably lurks ahead. The chaos and the sporadic sort of rewards make these relationships a very dangerous sort of casino to play in. Slot machines tend to be a sucker bet, and very, very few people win the jackpot. But in this case, this isn't just about some coins you're throwing in a machine. This is about your heart and soul, and you want to make sure you don't gamble your heart and soul away. Trauma bonding is real and it is painful. But if you can have the opportunity to do the psychological work, these bonds can be broken. It's my hope that this video has illuminated some of the themes of trauma bonding for you. It's a term that is often used when we're talking about narcissistic relationships, and by understanding it, you may also understand how in many cases, narcissistic relationship cycles are often lifelong cycles. And I'm going to lay out 8 common patterns we observe in trauma-bonded relationships. The term trauma bonded is often used to describe a key dynamic in the narcissistic relationship. It reflects a pattern whereby a person remains bonded or remains in an unhealthy relationship characterized by manipulation, invalidation, and emotional or other forms of abuse. Early experiences of neglectful, chaotic, inconsistent, and in some cases, frankly, abusive relationships impact attachment and relational expectations and result in an equating of love and abuse, or a relationship being a place where a person is always having to work to maintain a partner's interest. While the trauma bond most consistently plays out in adult, intimate relationships, it can also be reproduced in close friendships and relationships in the workplace. The language of trauma bonding is a little tricky. If used correctly, it is never meant to blame a survivor who is in one of these relationships, but rather to lay out the unconscious dynamics that may not have been adequately addressed in trauma-focused therapy, so a person can identify these patterns and become aware of the pathological dynamics inherent in the relationship. These are very difficult cycles to break, and it definitely takes time. In this video, I want to lay out 8 core dynamics we observe in trauma-bonded relationships. It can be useful to understand these so you are aware of what may be happening in your relationship. So pattern 1 is justification. Justification is the signature move of trauma-bonded, and in fact, all narcissistic relationships. The litany of they don't mean it, that my partner is stressed, my parent had a tough childhood, it's not their fault, blah, blah, blah. Justification in the trauma-bonded relationship is reflexive. You don't even think about it. It's a manifestation of the cognitive dissonance, a way to break that inconsistent thinking. I want this relationship to last. This person is being cruel to me. So you break that uncomfortable dissonance by saying, I know they're being mean to me, but they're stressed and they didn't mean it. And then you get to keep the relationship. Now, justification starts in childhood. The child attempting to justify the narcissistic or abusive parent's behavior or words. And this is how it becomes an almost reflexive pattern in adult relationships, and not only keeps people stuck in narcissistic and trauma-bonded relationships, but enables others. Number 2 is believing the future faking. Future faking is a key element of narcissistic relationships. Future faking is those many promises that are made in toxic relationships. Promises that are made about getting married, having children, where you're going to live. Sure, I'm going to support you when you go back to school. One day when I retire, we can do this and that. And it is also seen when things start getting unhealthy in a relationship, and you may even start making moves to leave the relationship, and then your partner says, I'm going to go get therapy, I'm going to work on myself. And it never does really happen, at least not in a substantial way.
and then you stay longer. People in trauma-bonded relationships want to believe, and as a result, even a little future fakey throwaway statements become a branch to hang on to and to pin those justifications on. People in trauma-bonded relationships may even share the future fakes with friends. My partner said that we are finally going to move so I can pursue my career closer to the city next year. The move will never come, and the trauma-bonded person lives in the hope, but never in the reality. Number 3 trauma-bonded pattern is you keep having the same fight over and over again. There is sort of what we call a repetition compulsion to the trauma-bonded relationship. The same fight over and over again happens with no resolution because the narcissistic or toxic partner has no intention of changing. It may be about money, about not spending enough time together, about a past indiscretion or lapse in trust, about your respective families, and it never ends. The same fight every holiday season. This is indicative of the lack of empathy or growth on the side of the unhealthy partner and the trauma-bonded partner caught in a cycle of hope and addressing the same issues and having the same argument, but hoping for a new outcome. A major piece that gets missed in the trauma-bonded relationship is that toxic personalities are really rigid and do not change. So in the absence of that recognition, the same cycle keeps repeating. Number 4, you have mystical, magical thinking about the trauma-bonded partner. People may even point out to the trauma-bonded person how unhealthy the patterns are in the relationship. And many people in trauma-bonded relationships will not be able to give clear and healthy reasons for staying in the relationship, but rather will say things like, I don't know. It's just something about my person. No one gets it, but it's just something. Something. This vague referencing is a form of magical justification that keeps a person stuck. It's something nobody can understand, right? So it's magic. When giving reasons for commitment, we look for hard and heavy stuff. Respect, kindness, compassion, mutuality, reciprocity, empathy, and growth. A person in a healthy relationship will be able to clearly articulate these clear reasons and not say, it's just something. Number 5 pattern is fear of leaving. A major theme in the trauma-bonded relationship is that even as a person gets closer to recognizing that this is not a healthy relationship and maybe I want to consider stepping away, a fear overcomes a person. The classical fear of most narcissistic relationships, self-doubt about what if I'm wrong? After so many years of making justifications and second-guessing and being confused, that confusion can drive a fear of leaving and going into the unknown. Trauma-bonded and toxic relationships are almost a form of indoctrination, like we would see in a cult. And the way a cult keeps people around is by generating fear of what is out there in the great unknown. Number 6 pattern is becoming a one-stop shop for your partner. In trauma-bonded relationships, we see the trauma-bonded person attempting to become a one-stop shop for the toxic or narcissistic partner or family member. Not only their partner, but you sort of trying to become a personal assistant who keeps everything running. You try to be their friend, their shrink, a parental figure who soothes them, their chef, their housekeeper, their cheerleader. You try to look the way they want and be what they want, which is exhausting because what they want at any given time can shift on the daily. And when they are not interested in you, they do not want to be bothered. So you just never know whether to be on or not. This zeal to be all things to the difficult person can overtake a person in a trauma-bonded relationship with the belief that if I do enough for them, they will be happy. Newsflash, they will never be happy. Not because you're lacking anything, but because they're not capable. Number 7 pattern is hiding your feelings and needs. This may be one of the most painful patterns of the trauma-bonded relationship, that you do not feel that you can share your feelings, your needs, your vulnerabilities. And you know what? It is actually true. You can't share those things, at least not without getting hurt. But the pattern of hiding needs and feelings in a trauma-bonded relationship is not about a survival strategy. It often reflects a self-devaluation and a fear of upsetting the narcissistic or toxic person. Again, back to that proverbial walking on eggshells. So holding back needs and feelings is a way of keeping the illusion of the relationship alive. Yes, you are right. Strategically, if you do decide to stay, you do not get to share your feelings because it is not worth the strife and disrespect. But that is from an informed place. And you can intentionally cultivate new and healthy supports. In a trauma-bonded relationship, hiding your feelings and needs is a way to keep the relationship afloat and a devaluation of self after a lifetime of relationships in which your feelings were not valued. Number 8 is rationalizing the relationship to other people or hiding the patterns from others. In trauma-bonded relationships, people often do not share what is really happening in the relationship with other people around them. People who are trauma-bonded are aware that what is happening in their relationship is not a good look, but for all the reasons I have listed here, people in these relationships are caught in a cycle of defending it to themselves. So, obviously, that defending it to themselves is going to extend to the world at large. Much like a child who's growing up in a very emotionally abusive or chaotic or invalidating home, who talks about their childhood in glowing or happy terms. The shame of being from an unhappy family is overwhelming. A trauma-bonded person may describe the relationship as good, may talk about the future faked stuff as though it is really happening, may hide the uncomfortable stuff, or be very vague when speaking about the relationship. What is so difficult about this is that it means that many trauma-bonded people do not get the support they need, since they are sort of offering up a rosy picture of their life, and in this way, they may not be hearing the dissenting voices, meaning that the patterns of justification sustain, and the person in this relationship remains more stuck. Even in therapy, and I have worked with lots of trauma-bonded people in therapy, initially, they will talk and share about the relationship and will back it up with, and that what's happening in my relationship, that's normal, right? This is just the daily stress of a relationship, right? And my job is to give them the gentle, no, it's not. As many of you hear about the trauma-bonded cycle, you may recognize that these are cycles we see in traditionally abusive relationships, such as those observed in domestic violence, in childhoods characterized by abuse and neglect, in abusive workplace situations. And these cycles are observed in all of those and in any relationship characterized by trauma bonding. You may be wondering, is this permanent? Can it change? Yeah, it can. And it is very effortful. In fact, trauma bonding is likely why when a person meets a partner who is stable and kind and compassionate and no drama, and will say, gosh darn it, this person is so nice and this whole relationship is so healthy, but I don't know, I don't think we have a connection. In the absence of the chaos and the frantic trying to get the partner to notice and jump through hoops, It's a place that nobody recognizes at home. It's not dysfunctional enough. It takes a while to let go of those worn patterns of childhood and break out of the cycles of drama equals love, abuse equals love, invalidation equals love. Trauma bonding can change, and it can and it does happen. And it requires you to understand the architecture of these relationships and of yourself. There is so much shame activated by these relationship cycles and then subsequent self blame. This isn't your fault. It's the not understanding it or not getting it. And sometimes, once you get it, you can start changing these patterns. I hope this gives you some clarity on the trauma bonded patterns that you might be reading this and saying, is that what the trauma bond is? I hope it gives you that clarity. And if you want to add anything to these 8 patterns, please do so. And just throw that in the comments so we can all benefit. Thank you. And I wonder how many of you ask yourself this question: why do I feel like I'm the bad person in my narcissistic relationship? Have any of you ever asked yourself that question? Like, I feel like I'm the bad one? If you did, drop it in the comments. It'd be interesting to see how many of you watching this saying, yes, I feel like I'm the bad one. We're going to break that down. Before we get to that, gentle reminder, go to those video notes. If you do feel like you're the bad person, you do need some healing, come join us in this healing program and hit that link. And also, please subscribe if you're new to this channel. If you end up liking this video, tiny bit of validation goes a long way for me. So let's take this question on around trauma bonding and self-blame. But why is it in narcissistic relationships that people, despite being narcissistically abused, that so many people feel like they are the bad person in these relationships? So at this point on this channel, on this YouTube channel, we have talked about trauma bonding ad nauseum, what it is, the different things that sort of describe trauma bonding. But mostly we talk about how trauma bonding keeps us stuck in these relationships or drawn to narcissistic relationships in the first place. What about after you decide to do something about your narcissistic relationship? Maybe you decide to end your relationship, or maybe you decide to go no contact with someone, or you massively gray rock or firewall, or not only disconnect from the narcissist, but all of the enablers. You do that. Then you look at the narcissistic person and they actually kind of seem sad to see you go, or they seem kind of lost without you, or they kind of slump about in a victimized way. Now, they may still also do and say manipulative, gaslighting, mean things when you're around them, but once you decide to do what you do, to step away maybe, you can see that they're impacted by it, even if they don't say it. And it's at that point when they're like, oh, this person's a little hurt. Nearly every survivor of narcissistic abuse I have ever talked to or worked with will say, I feel like I'm the bad person. I feel like I'm a bad person because I'm not talking to them anymore, or I'm not engaging, or I'm setting these boundaries with my parent or my ex or my adult child or my friend or my sibling. I feel like I'm mean. I feel like I've become so dark-hearted. And then it starts to slip pretty quickly from there, and people start thinking, maybe I'm a monster. Maybe I'm the narcissist. Pushing back on narcissistic abuse is no joke. It sounds so easy in words. Oh, don't defend, don't engage, don't explain, gray rock, don't respond, walk away. Intellectually, we can all acknowledge that those are all choices, and probably good ones in a narcissistic relationship. But when you make those choices, you feel sick. Many people literally report feeling sick to their stomachs, losing their appetite, getting headaches, just because they're setting consistent boundaries, or when they finally say enough is enough and don't engage. You know the dance. You all do. You know that if you stay in this relationship, nothing's ever going to change. And many people do stay just so they don't have to feel sick and don't have to feel like the bad person, to not have to feel like that mean person. Actually doing it, actually setting the boundary, actually not engaging, actually seeing that when you pull away, in more than a few cases, the narcissistic person may look lost or sad or pathetic. They may actually look like they miss you, or they tell you how much you ruined their lives, or they go really heavy on all the self-victimized stuff. It's a terrible feeling. It's as though every trauma bonded cell in your body orients toward not wanting to be the one that feels like the bad one, the mean one, the cold one. And you may even feel that perhaps this relationship is sort of your penance or your bad luck, and you stick it out so you don't have to feel like a bad person. If you really want to hear a sick twist on this one, I was raised in a very traditional Hindu South Asian family where I have had contact with many, many people who are in terrible marriages or terrible family situations say, I am being punished from my behavior in a past life. I must owe this person, and they're talking about the abuser, something. So I'm telling you now, I know about some deep trauma bonded cultural religious stuff that can twist a person's mind. So many survivors of narcissistic abuse are at risk for feeling that it's easier to take the role of enduring the narcissist's BS and maltreatment than it is to walk away and manage not only the discomfort of feeling like the cruel one, but also manage all the criticisms you'll get from people outside of you, outside of the relationship. Now, there's no easy answer here. It's a process. You do have to pay attention to how you feel. Now, when the narcissist is cut out of your life and they're not around, you're going to feel better in many ways. Less stressed, more content, maybe even happy. Over time, you may feel more brave, courageous. And the less and less contact you have with the narcissist, maybe even less plagued by self-doubt. While some narcissists don't care if you leave, many do. And remember that abandonment and related issues are a part of narcissism. So they may actually not do well when you go. And there will be times you will be ruminating on that icky, awful feeling of having done something to someone that does not feel good to you. The more empathic you are, the more this way of thinking is going to bring you down. Sadly, this is where your empathy, a wonderful part of you, is actually kind of keeping you stuck. Your empathy makes you vulnerable to falling back into it as well because you don't want to feel like a bad person because you're not. This is the legacy of narcissistic abuse I actually hate the most. The idea that stepping away and setting boundaries and saving yourself, that you have to carry along with that, this burden that you're not a nice person. And sadly, the prevailing wisdom in the world is that the people who put up and shut up are somehow, maybe they're not so mean, right? Because it means that at some level, survivors of narcissistic abuse cannot win. They either have to be abused in the relationship or live with this sense that you did something bad. Well, here's the good news. Over time, that idea that you are bad, it'll slowly fade. Narcissistic abuse changes us in permanent ways. It means that we cannot live like little children in a fantasy world anymore. That we recognize that life is a series of really hard choices that are often unpopular, especially if we are trying to attempt to protect ourselves. And there's no magical moment when a fairy god person comes down and waves a wand and makes the trauma bonds go away or gives us a happy ending after our trauma bonds. Nope. Survivors of narcissistic abuse learn that to set boundaries and disengage is uncomfortable and unpopular. And with time, we recognize that no, we are not bad people, but that we did have to save ourselves. And yet that felt really uncomfortable. Many of you know that I believe that a major part of healing is journaling and record keeping. A powerful method of doing that, pessimistic and awful as it feels, is to write down all of the bad things that happened in the relationship. I want you to keep all of the abusive text messages and emails. When those trauma bonded feelings come up, when you feel guilty or bad or mean, please read all of that. When you feel that you are being mean or bad or misreading the situation, going back and seeing all that stuff you wrote down that was sent to you, it can be eye-opening and it can be your salvation. At some level, getting out of a toxic relationship and the bad feelings that accompany it are a form of survivor guilt. Self-preservation and self-protection are all very nice sounding words, but putting them into practice is a whole other level. And it's a whole nother experience for people who are trauma bonded. You always feel like you're trying to swim against some kind of psychological current or riptide. So, no, I'm here to tell you, you are not a bad person for setting boundaries and disengaging and creating distance from someone who harmed you and will continue to harm you. You made a choice to take care of yourself. The narcissistic person is making a choice too, to abuse people, including you. They have the freedom to make another choice. They just aren't. Their bad choice, though, cannot remain your prison. Hope that makes sense. But that thinking I'm the bad person for these things I'm doing in this relationship, like distancing myself and seeing the victimization on their face, you are not a bad person. That is a classic manipulation, and I want to break you out of that. I understand it's uncomfortable, but all growth is uncomfortable. Trauma bonds can feel like super glue. They feel impossible to get unstuck. Trauma bonds represent lifelong lessons, lessons that are not good for you. Things like love equals rejection, love equals shame and humiliation, or that love means having to win someone over or please them or reassure them. Trauma bonds mean having the same fights over and over again, justifying the bad behavior and the red flags, pushing down your own feelings and not sharing them, isolation and shame. Sometimes, as some people will put it, feeling a magical, unnameable connection that you keep coming back to despite how bad it is for you. The trauma bond is a catch 22 of sorts. When you are in the relationship, it feels terrible a lot of the time, with experiences like invalidation, gaslighting, rage, manipulation, dismissiveness, contempt. When the relationship ends or goes away, maybe you break it off, maybe they break it off, you feel this terrible sense of emptiness. You can't breathe. You ruminate. You feel like you made a mistake. You feel anxious. You're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. So here is a little trick. A little bit of mindful awareness that you can use or you can do while you are in a narcissistic relationship. Because I'm aware that many people watching these videos are still very much stuck in a wide range of narcissistic relationships and still not sure what to do. So bear with me. So next time that you are away from your narcissistic person, maybe it's a few hours during the workday. Maybe it's for several days if they have to travel for work or something. Maybe for a half a day or a whole day if they go out to do something. At such a time, you don't have the narcissist with you. I want you to do something. I want you to pay attention to how you feel. Like, I want you to really pay attention. Journal, talk about it, do what you need to do, but really pay attention. When they are not there, narcissist isn't around, how do you feel? I can't be the one to answer that question for you, but I'm going to spitball a little here that for a significant majority of you, the answers may be things like, I feel more relaxed. Or in some cases, you may sleep better. I mean, I know for a few of you, if the narcissist isn't around, you may ruminate about stuff like infidelity. That's a separate issue. Most of you may sleep better. You may feel more like yourself when they're not around. You may breathe more deeply. You may laugh more. You may do things that you want, eat things you want, engage in activities you want. You may enjoy the quiet. You may feel like you are in a better rhythm. You may find yourself to be more in sync with children, with pets, with other people that interact with your household. You may feel a little less eggshelly. You may not feel like you have to be careful about what you do or say, or feel like you have to move around the house in a tense and fearful way. All of this gets tricky. It's an important exercise. The trauma bond often means that people will say, yes, I enjoyed it. I enjoyed the time away. But part of that was because I knew they were coming back. If I thought they were never coming back, may not be so great. But this isn't just the idea that I can fall asleep reading, which I can't do when my partner's home, or I can eat cereal for dinner and not deal with the dishes. I really want you to think about how you feel when this person is not in your space or is not in your house. If you feel better as a person, more relaxed, more authentic, more you, pay attention to that. Many people fall into the justification that, oh, everyone likes a break from their partner from time to time. Yeah, sure. But this is more than that. If you feel like you are a better you when they are away, that's an important piece of information. If you feel like it's easier for you to get through the world when they're not there, that's an important piece of information. And as a part of this thought experiment, I want you to close your eyes and imagine what life would be like if you felt like this every day. How would that feel? How would your life be different? How would you live differently? I would love to hear from you, and if you could, drop your answers in the comments below if you feel comfortable. I have worked over the years with many, many people who had narcissistic parents while they were growing up. And without exception, they would share about how they felt on those wonderful and miraculous days and weeks, if they were lucky, months, when the narcissistic parent was away. They would often see their other parent relax a bit more. The eggshells got swept away for a few days. The entire household would be less tense. It would feel like a holiday just because that parent was on a business trip or whatever. The household just felt less intense. Everyone was happier. The parent would come home, and the tension and the dark cloud were back. The child may not have known what narcissism was, but they started getting a fuller picture of what the presence of that parent meant and how good it felt when they weren't around. Now, thinking about when the narcissistic person in your life as an adult is away, for the small group of you who said, no, 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 when the narcissistic person in my life is away, I feel so much worse. I know that it is awful and abusive when they are around, but I have a lot of trouble being alone, and being around a rager is still better than being alone. That I gotta tell you, then the issues around trauma bonds and relational dynamics is deeper than what I am talking about here. And in such a case, therapy would be absolutely essential to explore that, because those are going to be deeper things to disentangle. For many people who are in narcissistic relationships, the confusion, the cognitive dissonance, the trauma bondedness, the fear, the hope can pull a person away from really paying attention to how they feel when the narcissistic person is not around. People are so accustomed to fighting in and fighting for these relationships that they forget how good it feels when they are alone and they can finally exhale. Vulnerability to hoovering is highest in the weeks and months after a relationship obviously ends, which is why at that time, all of the time needs to go into those lists I always want people to make. All of the bad things that happened in the relationship, for example. So you can be reminded of how bad it really was, and then pay attention to how good it really is that you aren't on edge and can finally sweep the damned eggshells out of your house. I remember once, a long time ago, talking to a woman who had been married for a really, really long time to a very narcissistic man in a very traditional marriage. She liked the idea of being married. She liked being a mother. She liked keeping a sort of a gracious home. She acknowledged that there was something about the traditional role that really worked for her. And it was really an offset to some of the sort of the chaos of her own childhood. Her husband, however, was a major malcontent, an abusive, raging, cheap, awful person. Nothing was joyful or fun with him. After their children were grown and out of the house, she caught him in about the 7th extramarital affair he had had, and finally she felt it was just too humiliating to stay in it. Kids were out of the house. The divorce was incredibly messy, incredibly expensive, and he pulled every narcissistic trick in the book. After about a year, she decided to take her first solo vacation. She had not traveled alone for a very, very long time. As she made her way through the airport alone, she had talked about how sad and how lonely she felt, especially seeing other people traveling in groups. When we talked about her focusing instead on what it would feel like if the nasty, irritable, monstrous, narcissistic husband had been there with her, she smiled and she said, if I had thought about it that way in the airport, it wouldn't have felt so lonely. In fact, it would have felt really good to move to the airport at my pace and browse in the windows and get the snack I wanted. So after a trauma-bonded relationship, it is easy to get caught in the idea of romanticizing the idea of togetherness or the relationship. But if you really close your eyes and think about how really pleasant it is when they are not around, it can go a long way to cutting away at those trauma bonds. The problem is people focus so much on their loneliness, they don't stop to think about how good it feels when the narcissists aren't around. As always, thanks again for tuning in. Please give the video a thumbs up if you found it useful. The feedback definitely helps me know what people want to hear about or don't. And also the comments help people learn even more and helps us spread the word on narcissism so more and more people can learn to grow resistant to it, and hopefully we can tune down the number of enablers. Thanks again.